Well, thanks for having the honor and pleasure of speaking at this wonderful conference. I want to share some ideas and arguments from my current book project on democratic knowledge. And I want to start by pointing to some of the current issues that show the nexus of power and knowledge. One important discussion, and I guess it will keep occupying us for the next couple of years, maybe even, is about the patents for COVID vaccines, which are currently the property of certain private companies. And many people have an intuition that from a moral perspective, the knowledge of how to produce COVID vaccines should be public and maybe even a global public good, such that as many people as possible can get quick access to COVID vaccines. Another discussion where this relation between knowledge and power is being discussed is about the data collection of online firms. What should they know? What should they not know about citizens? And just yesterday, news broke about some apparent spyware attacks on journalists, which is a special case, of course, but which again shows this importance of how knowledge and information are being handled in our societies, which many sociologists have described as knowledge societies. And there's, of course, this old slogan that knowledge is power. And what I look at in my current research is how the organization of knowledge and society matters for the distribution of power in society. And I know that the term neoliberal has become completely vague and a kind of fighting bird, and it's maybe not very academic to use it, but just as a shorthand for a certain pro-market approach, I think it's fair to say that part of that pro-market neoliberal agenda has always been a claim that markets are the best institutions for dealing with knowledge in society. And that's what I want to challenge in my work. I'll show some very schematic presentations of how I think about different forms of knowledge in society. And I know that this is incredibly rough, but I think that even this very simple scheme can help us to understand some of the current problems and some of the current injustices that mar our societies. I distinguish three types of knowledge. Knowledge about preferences, for which markets can indeed be a suitable instrument under certain conditions. Expert knowledge, for which we need different mechanisms, where I draw on work on democratic professionalism for thinking about the relation between expertise and democracy. And what, for lack of a better term, I've called common knowledge, the kind of knowledge that is needed for making political decisions that needs to be shared by everyone, for which deliberative politics are the best means. And again, this is a very rough scheme, but one can say that the neoliberal approach has been to claim that markets are indeed the best instrument for all types of knowledge and the production and transmission and integration of all these different forms. Whereas I would argue that, what we need in order to have an epistemically well-functioning democracy is to take deliberative politics as a starting point and to ask how both expert knowledge and market mechanisms can be integrated, but also clearly governed by and under a primacy of democratic politics. So one slogan for that kind of project is an epistemic primacy of politics, if you like. Now, why did this idea of economic knowledge and markets as mechanisms for knowledge transmission become so powerful? There's a very famous paper by Friedrich August von Hayek from 1945, which makes this case that markets are processors of knowledge. And behind that, there is a long tradition, and in particular, the socialist calculation debate, which took place between the 1930s and 1950s, about the way in which different economic systems can deal with decentralized knowledge. And the argument of the pro-market camp has been, in different variations, that price mechanisms can ensure the adaptation of supply and demand. And how do they do so? They allow the integration of forms of decentral knowledge, because, and I think that is a point that one can grant to that camp, in modern complex societies, we don't have only the kind of knowledge that everyone can share. There are lots of forms of knowledge that are decentralized, that are local, that people may not even be able to put into words, which is then described as tacit knowledge. And for that, we need mechanisms of social integration. And what Hayek and Mises and many others have argued is that markets allow for the efficient allocation of goods and services through a constant adaptation, which are governed by the coordination mechanism of markets. And financial markets are then seen as a particular instrument for integrating knowledge about investment opportunities, the allocation of capital. And in the end, they're seen really as a kind of real life mirror of the economic system. So whatever happens on the financial markets tells you what's going on in society and that what matters about political decision making. That's the neoliberal perspective. One should, however, immediately say that this is a limitation of knowledge to a very specific kind. It's knowledge about supply and demand. What do people want and what can they offer? There is no sense of what other forms of knowledge could actually look like in this market process. And Hayek explicitly delineates his approach from scientific knowledge. So this remains an open question. How should we deal with expert knowledge? Can it be dealt with in markets? So from that perspective, there is a mechanism in society that is really the go-to mechanism whenever you have any kind of knowledge issues. It's to switch to market mechanisms and the language of prices. But of course, there's an immediate issue here, which is that if that's the language you use for thinking about the distribution of knowledge in society, then those with more purchasing power have more to say. And here you immediately see that there's a gender dimension here, because the distribution of income and wealth in society, in our patriarchal societies, has a very clear male bias. So if it's the language of prices, on average, male voices count more because men tend to have more income. There's also here a problem of insufficient attention to distortions of market knowledge that can arrive, for example, through market failures such as negative environmental externalities. All the effects of our economic activity that have to do with CO2 emissions are not really integrated because we don't have a realistic price on CO2. And that, of course, changes the kinds of messages that prices can send. For example, if you have very cheap airline tickets, the environmental impact is in no way reflected in those prices. And in the last step of this logical argument about this powerful ability of markets to deal with knowledge itself becomes nothing but a commodity. And for profit maximizing agents, it's pretty clear what you then do with knowledge. If it promises to be profitable, then you should acquire that knowledge and you should secure it and privatize it, put patents on it, put copyright on it, not let others access it. Whereas, on the other hand, if there are forms of knowledge that imply that there are certain responsibilities, for example, to prevent climate change, then those forms of knowledge, as mere commodities from that perspective, should be marginalized or excluded or socialized. Put it into the social realm, it's society as a whole that is responsible, it's not our business. That's how profit-oriented actors deal with commodities. And if knowledge is treated as a commodity, that's the effects that we see. There's nothing surprising about that at all, in a way. Now, this way of thinking about knowledge and the economic pictures that stand behind it has long been criticized. And I hear it draw on a few lines of criticism from feminist economics. And I've put this book cover on my slide from Marcel, who had this very nice book title, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, in order to point out that this picture is actually pretty one-sided in leaving out all the forms of care work and the social relations that are needed in order for economic transactions to take place in the first place. So in this economic picture, individuals are described as autonomous atoms in a way. That's one metaphor that's often used then. And there is an assumption of equality in the sense that all market participants are conceptualized as equal. But that is, of course, a huge problem because it hides all the ways in which people are de facto unequal. And so there's no sense about the necessity to enable equal access to markets, for example. It's just assumed and no further questions are asked. If you take this approach, there's also no market price for care work. And so it is made invisible. Care work, if it's taking place without wage, is not part of GDP. And so it's not visible what's going on there and how much these things are needed. And during the Corona crisis, there were these debates suddenly, we need all these people doing care work for our societies, both paid and unpaid. And usually they're not taken very seriously, not giving a prominent place in our review of the economy. But without them, our societies would collapse. And more generally speaking, those preconditions of markets, which feminists like, for example, Nancy Fraser have described as the social reproduction issue, they are neglected. And last but not least, within markets, in theory, they should be gender blind. It should just matter who offers what and who has what purchasing power. But de facto, there's often blatant discrimination. And as you probably know, Gary Becker has developed this whole field of research, the economics of discrimination, that describes these things from a certain methodological perspective as if they were just part of the normal economic game without an appropriate normative standpoint, I would say. So there are all kinds of problems about this way of thinking about knowledge from an economic perspective, and yet it's extremely powerful in our societies. And I now want to contrast it with a democratic approach to knowledge. And in the end, I want to speak a bit about how we can take steps to strengthen democratic over economic knowledge. Democratic knowledge, of course, this is again a sort of Max Weber type, ideal type of how to think about knowledge and knowledge production. And it's very influenced in my thinking by democratic theorists like Habermas, but also John Dewey. The idea here is that the democratic ideal is one of equality. So what we want is egalitarian, inclusive deliberation. And you all know the famous phrase by Habermas, it's the persuasive force of the better argument that is supposed to win. Not power, not status, not money, but the better argument. And in recent debates in democratic theory, there have been lots of discussions about how we can actually make an epistemic argument for the inclusion of all members of society in democratic deliberation. That's something that Ellen Landemore has particularly worked on, because the more people are involved in democratic deliberation, the more likely it is that we can really take all perspectives into account, discover all possible solutions, all ideas that are around, and so on. And there is this debate about whether, from a purely epistemic, knowledge-based perspective, democracy is better than all other possible forms of government or not. Where some other thinkers have said, no, we should actually go for some kind of epistocracy, as Jason Brannon has called this. I think that the epistemic arguments in favor of democracy are quite strong. But my own take is that we shouldn't base our commitment to democracy purely on epistemic arguments. I'm a democrat out of deeper convictions and egalitarian commitments, not just epistemic arguments. But if we accept democracy as the political system we want to have, then we can ask the question, how can we design democracies and design democratic procedures in ways that are as epistemically powerful as possible to lead to good outcomes for citizens? And of course, as a matter of fact, there are many epistemic injustices in the ways in which our societies conduct their democratic deliberations. Miranda Fricker has started this debate about epistemic injustice, although there were previous similar ideas also in law, as has recently been pointed out, but she was the one that made this term famous, and there's now a lot of research on epistemic injustice. And the strength of democracy here is that it is not that it doesn't have problems of epistemic injustice, but it is that it can reflexively correct these. If they are recognized, something can be done about them. In that sense, the reflexivity of democracy that has often been emphasized in democratic theory also applies to its epistemic side and the way in which it deals with possible problems of exclusion or discrimination. And given that there are these epistemic arguments for inclusion, often we can expect that epistemic injustice, this is actually the wrong way around on the slide, epistemic injustice, fighting against epistemic injustice can improve epistemic outcomes. So the more we get rid of unjustified prejudices, exclusions of people on the basis of gender or color or so on, the better we can expect the democratic deliberation to be. And democratic decisions can then rein in and regulate markets, though, and that's also a well-known problem, in a situation that we currently have of a global economic system and democratic deliberation that takes place mostly on the national level, there is this problem of international challenge. But recently there were some moves to at least coordinate some tax rates, so maybe the appetite for international cooperation will grow a bit in the future. So how can we strengthen democratic knowledge vis-a-vis economic ways of thinking about and dealing with knowledge? One very important argument is that it's not markets as such, without any view to regulation, that would per se provide the epistemic benefits that have been claimed in their favor. It's markets that correspond to the textbook models, and for real life markets to correspond at least roughly to the textbook models, you often do need regulation. For example, to get rid of market failure such as externalities. And that means that insofar as our societies rely on market knowledge, and we do so in many, many areas, we need to set market frameworks such that they actually process the socially relevant forms of knowledge and not some kind of distorted forms of knowledge that don't reflect the real impact of economic actions. And I already mentioned the problem of a CO2 price. Our economic systems would look drastically different if we had a realistic price on CO2 at the moment. And economists have argued for this for a long time. But the political will is still lacking, unfortunately. We also need to strengthen democratic oversight in many areas where this imbalance between markets and democracy in dealing with knowledge has led to excessive forms of profit seeking at the cost of other market actors, but also society as a whole. And there are too many examples for me to really go into details here, but I'll just name two. One is the reining in of the kind of data capitalism where data companies collect anything they can find about individuals, buying different data sets, using them to try to target individuals with advertisement. Also recently, and these debates are well known, with political advertisement. The EU is making many moves in this direction. But of course, many of the companies are based in the US, and so this doesn't really, it's more difficult to apply. But this is an area where basic questions about the relation between democratic rights on the one hand and economic rights on the other are at stake, and where there has been a kind of Wild West mentality of just letting companies do what they want to do, which urgently needs to be corrected. Another issue, and I've also mentioned this in the beginning, is the intellectual property rights regime that we have at the moment, which, according to many analyses, mostly benefits the holders of intellectual property rights at the cost of society as a whole and at the costs of other potential producers of intellectual property. So copyright is arguably far too long, and patents are treated far too absolute as rights claims, and especially in the area of medications, drugs, a lot could be done to improve the situation. And I've mentioned Corona. This is, of course, it's a big debate. I'm not saying that it's enough to change the property rights regime there. You need also technology transfer and lots of other things. But it's a clear case where we see that the current system of assuming that markets are best, so let's deal with knowledge in markets, let's do the companies all the work, that's not going to lead to the best social outcomes that we can hope for. It will lead to quick production of knowledge if you can make profits, but then you're locked in a situation where it's the companies that hold that knowledge, and society as a whole is sort of at the mercy of what these companies decide to do or not to do with it. Another take on this whole constellation of democratic and economic knowledge is that we need to strengthen what I call the epistemic infrastructure of democracy. So in the German-speaking world, there is a famous dictum about democracy, which is not very well known in the Anglophone world, from what I can tell, the Böckenförde dictum, which says that democracies depend on conditions that they themselves cannot create. And I sort of agree with the first half of that, but not the second half. I agree with the part that democracies depend on conditions that may at first glance not seem to have anything to do with political democracy, that are more in the social realm and so on. I don't so much agree with the second part that they cannot create them. I think democracies need to think about the conditions of the possibility of being successful democracies, stable democracies, and that includes taking into account the ways in which knowledge that is needed for democracies to function well, to be processed, to be accessible to citizens to be epistemically enabled to take part in political debates. And the term epistemic infrastructure is meant to describe the fact that these are infrastructures in the sense that they really determine how we can live our lives, and they are the basis for the functioning of our democratic decision-making processes. And that concerns many areas. I'll just mention two here: the way in which schools teach people to be citizens, or do they just teach them to be better employees in the future to maximize some companies' profits? I think schools are a basic political and democratic institution. And there are also many questions one can ask about the media system. And now with all the new social media, the way in which the online advertisement world has undermined the traditional business model of many newspapers. So thinking about what kind of media system we need for democracy, that's the kind of task. And then regulating the markets that we have in this area according to these democratic principles. Also, and that brings me back to the issue of epistemic justice. There's a lot that needs to be done to improve epistemic justice in order to keep the egalitarian promises of equal inclusion of everyone in democracies. And yesterday we already heard a lot about the way in which the voices of women have far too often been excluded from these kinds of discussions. And in the debate about epistemic justice and injustice, there is, of course, a strong focus on gender and race, and that is crucial and very important. I don't want to deny this in any way, but I want to add something. And that is a focus on class and socioeconomic background. And the reason for that is that we have reached levels of inequality in our societies that are, as Thomas Piketty has shown, like late 19th century feudal societies in a way, or early industrial societies, huge inequalities such that all talk about equal opportunities is really a bit of a sham if you look at how unequal the conditions for children from different families are. And so when we think about epistemic justice, whose voices count in democratic discourse, gender and race are important, but socioeconomic background is too. And of course, and that's something that I don't have to tell this audience here, it's intertwined with gender and race. So these intersections matter a lot. And I think one can also make an indirect argument here, or I try to do so in my book project, about the need to reduce socioeconomic inequalities. Because for democracies to function well with regard to knowledge, for knowledge to flow between individuals, for individuals to be willing to share knowledge and so on, it's important to build trust in society. At both epistemic trust and also social trust. Because if people don't trust each other, how can they develop the kind of energy to hold the powerful to account? I mean, there's a lot of psychology behind the question of who gets engaged in democratic politics, and trust is a key factor here. And there is a plethora of empirical studies that show that the greater socioeconomic inequality in a society, the lower general trust between citizens. And that means that citizens who don't trust each other have a more difficult time sharing knowledge, trusting information they get from each other, and then using it in order to engage in democratic action. So I'm getting to the conclusion. In recent years, there have been also lots of debates about a different kind of approach of how to strengthen democratic inclusivity and to make sure that everyone, different genders, different races, and different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds has an equal chance to participate in democratic discourse. And that has been described as the lotocratic alternative. Lotocratic means that you use lotteries, randomization, to choose representatives who could speak for people, to participate in, for example, deliberative polls or deliberative mini-publics. There have been all kinds of experiments about these things. And this is a very interesting strategy. And there have been cases in France and Germany and in other regions, in other countries as well, to use these kinds of randomized deliberative formats in order to bridge this gap that is often perceived between formal politics and citizens, and to make sure that politics is really for everyone in society. But I think there are all kinds of questions about how successful these kinds of experiments can be. For example, how do the media report about it? Do they then actually get the word out to everyone in society? What's the connection to the rest of the political system? Are the results taken up by parliaments, for example? And also, is there a certain risk of capture by the coaches and facilitators and invited experts that run these kinds of sessions? So I think we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket here and think that lotocratic institutions would be the best strategy for saving democracy, as it were. I think at least as important, and that's also in a way a very old feminist issue, is to strengthen access of all social groups to the representative institutions of democracy that we already have in parliaments, in expert commissions, at all levels of politics. Jane Mansbridge has argued for this and has described a number of ways, from sort of soft nudges to get more women into politics, for example, up to hard quota solutions. And I think these have both democratic but also epistemic justifications, because it ensures that more voices are being heard in politics and that democratic deliberation therefore can deliver better. And in the end, the ideal of democracy that is probably best able to deliver on these epistemic counts and to really take up the knowledge of the many in this old formula from Aristotle is a participatory form of democracy, as Carol Pateman and others have described it, where it's not only the political system in a strict sense of elections and parliaments and so on, but also everyday institutions, including economic institutions, where people participate in decision-making, where they can build the capacity of how to participate in politics, where they can develop the meta-knowledge for how you make decisions among equals and thereby practice to be good democrats and also to be good epistemic democrats, thereby strengthening the capacity of our democracy to really get the primacy that democracy deserves in order to rein in markets and the risk of expertocracy, which I haven't really discussed today, such that it's democratic knowledge and not economic knowledge that really guides decision-making. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm afraid there's no discussion, but if you have any feedback or any questions, I'd be very keen to hear from you, and I'll leave my email here. Thank you very much.